Hello, and thanks for joining us for this special Classics Now online conversation. I'm really delighted to welcome our two guests this evening and to introduce them. I'm going to speak very briefly and then I'm going to hand over to our guests. So Shadi Bartsch is Professor of Classics at the University of Chicago. She is a specialist in Roman imperial literature and in rhetoric and philosophy, and she is an award-winning classicist. Her recent translation of Virgil's Aeneid was vivid and gripping. And amazingly, while she was writing that and working through the Latin translation, she was also busily translating Chinese texts from Mandarin. And this is for her new book, just published by Princeton University Press, and it's called Plato Goes to China, Greek Classics and Chinese Nationalism. And that is going to be, I think, where this conversation will start. And our other guest is Dame Mary Beard, Cambridge Professor Emerita and Fellow of Newnham College, Cambridge. She is one of Britain's best-known classical scholars and public intellectuals. She has published widely and deeply on Roman history in particular, and she's also made acclaimed documentaries about ancient history for television. Mary is the classics editor of the Times Literary Supplement, where she also writes a very engaging and witty blog called A Dawn's Life. She is also a trustee of the British Museum, currently very much in the headlines for all sorts of reasons to do with the Parthenon sculptures. Mary travels widely, giving lectures, and recently she gave one in Zurich, which you can also watch online, and it's fascinating. And the title is Classics, Does It Have a Future? And here at Classics Now, we certainly hope that it does. What kind of future it has, I think, is one of the topics that our two guests may touch on over the next 45 minutes or so. It's a great, great pleasure to hand over now to Mary Beard and let you two continue this conversation. Thank you.
Helen, thank you very much, and it's absolutely great to be talking to Shadi about this book. In the few weeks after it was published, and I want to start with you a bit, Shadi. Here, and Helen's already kind of hinted at this. The book is called Plato Goes to China, and it is very wide-ranging, and we will see just how wide-ranging it is. But it comes down to what the title says, a careful look at how Plato and other classics of Greek philosophy have been received and debated in China, mostly, not entirely, but mostly over the last 150 years or so now. I want to know how you came to do this. Because we think of you with great admiration as a literary and cultural critic of the ancient world. Where does this come from, and how did you set about it, and why?
Thanks so much, Mary, for that question. I think what happened was about 10 years ago, I, out of the blue, had this thought that, look at me, I'm a classics professor, but I've been educated in a system that uses the classics to a large degree. And is there not a sense in which I am sitting in my own bathwater, or, in a hall of mirrors? I've been conditioned by these texts to think a certain way, and now I'm commenting on these texts. But what if I had come from a culture that was less familiar with these texts? Would I be saying something different about them? And the impetus for this thought was having read just a little bit about Chinese culture and philosophy, and coming to, for me, the startling revelation that although the West, or Western thought, often privileged rationality as a human quality that rendered us different from animals and was somehow semi-godlike and, allowed us to build the Parthenon and airplanes and what have you. So I lost the beginning of that sentence. I think the beginning of that sentence was the realization that this rationality that I had come to take for granted as a wonderful thing about human beings was not necessarily in other cultures the most wonderful thing about human beings. And I was very struck that one of the tenets of Confucian philosophy, which of course has a very long and complicated history, one of the tenets was that one of the noblest qualities of a human being was not rationality. They actually don't talk much about rationality at all, but ren, which means humaneness. And the whole philosophy is geared towards attaining the state of humaneness towards your fellow human beings. And I thought, well, yes, I prefer humaneness to rationality, come to think of it, you know? So what's this with rationality? And then the more I inspected the tradition, the more I saw the incredible weight put on rationality right from Plato all the way through. You know, you've got Aristotle, you've got Descartes, you've got Kant. It's all there. They're all building their philosophy on premises that are deduced from other premises that are deduced from other premises that are supposedly deduced from axiomatic truths. So this was a big shock to me, and I decided, well, you know, if even this is questionable, this assumption that I've made, what else is questionable about the Western tradition?
Yeah, but you know, I still think you're being a bit modest, because those are the big aspirations. But as I understand it from the book, I mean, you then went and learnt Mandarin.
Boy, yes.
So, you know, I think lots of us think, gosh, there's a lot that a different tradition, like the Chinese tradition, has got to show us about our own, about the assumptions that we make. And I think you're very good in this book about saying, look, we've been brought up with these kind of Western civ assumptions, and then we judge our own thought on the basis of them. And isn't that a little bit circular? And it's very persuasive. But you then say you learnt Mandarin and it was jolly hard. So, I mean, how long did this take?
Oh, God, it hasn't ended. So, you know, because I know some Indo-European languages, I thought at the beginning of this great experiment, oh, I'll just learn Mandarin and carry on. And the reason I knew I had to learn Mandarin was that all the scholarship that was being written about these classical texts that was getting a wide audience in China. So I mean, kind of the public-facing scholarship, the political scholarship, the nationalistic scholarship, all of it was in Mandarin. And there are no translations to be had. There still aren't. No. So there's no way of getting access to that material unless you can actually read Mandarin. So I thought, oh, I'll just learn Mandarin. And I think it must be year 10, year 12 now. I'm still struggling. I can have basic conversations, but you know, if the other person talks too fast, I'm completely lost. Yeah. And it's been a real trip. And the first part of this whole journey was actually the funniest part, because I had no idea how important the tones were. And so I would go to China and I would massacre the language and say things I didn't mean to say. And I did that right from the start when I learned what I thought was the expression for excuse me. Before the first time I went to China. And I pushed my way through Beijing saying, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me. And everybody kind of did a little hop and looked at me. And I thought, oh, they're just not used to a Westerner speaking such perfect Mandarin. And then I got back and I started taking Mandarin classes. And it turns out I had the tones wrong. And instead of saying, excuse me, I was saying, please smell me.
Yeah.
So embarrassing. So embarrassing. But anyhow, I slogged on and got better at it. And, you know, learning to speak is one thing, and then learning the characters is a whole other thing. And it's just very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I thought this was a model for us all, you know, because it is very easy to want to be comparative, to want to put, say, classics or anything in a global context. And yeah, that is all good, except actually it's hard, and some of the most interesting stuff is in languages that are going to take you 10 years to learn. Wow. So there is a huge investment. I think that said, it wonderfully paid off, because I mean,
I learned so much from it. I mean, I feel changed as a result of having done all that.
Yeah, and I thought that, you know, I can see how this book is going to get summarized, as I've done actually, in, you know, 100 words in, you know, bookshops or libraries or to students. This is about how the, not entirely recent, because you go back to some frightfully plucky Jesuits, but slightly odd plucky Jesuits, but mostly it's from the beginning of the 20th century, and one of the things you do is you do help us to understand about what a Chinese engagement with these texts might be. I mean, and they're very different engagements and it changes. But I thought that what was amazing about the book was that it managed to kind of balance so many different perspectives on the texts, on different engagements with the text, on us looking at Chinese engagements with the text, and vice versa. I mean, can you just say a bit more about that kind of multifocality of this book? Because, you know, I think it would be to do it not a justice, actually, to say, oh, this is about how Chinese, not so much Chinese classical scholars, but Chinese intellectual public figures have looked at particularly Plato, but also Aristotle and Thucydides. But it's much more than that. I mean, what more do you see in it now, looking back?
So I started with the Jesuits, although it may seem an unlikely place, because I wanted to show that this wasn't a book about Chinese intellectuals reading the Western classics in ways we didn't agree with, and that was egregious and so forth. I wanted to show that anytime one is reading with a purpose to persuade, or a purpose to change ideological beliefs, or a purpose to bolster a political regime or a religious regime for that matter, one simply reads differently, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And, you know, the Jesuits claimed they were teaching Christianity, but Matteo Ricci, bless his heart, was leaning very heavily on Epictetus, which was much more tolerable to the Confucians at court than this crazy story of a god that got, you know, killed on a crucifix and so forth. So I wanted to show that it happens, you know, in every country, in every culture, in all sorts of ways. But then the first part that really interested me was that when the Chinese dynastic system was starting to totter at the end of the 19th century, and some brave intellectuals who were Chinese but who were writing in Japan for safety's sake started reading Western and classical texts and Enlightenment texts and Renaissance texts, what they found was so alien to them that words didn't exist in Mandarin to describe it. And so Liang Qichao, for example, in 1898, had to coin a word for citizen, because the concept didn't exist in the dynastic system, where you had the family and the tiered familial relationships, and then the emperor, who was the father writ large. And of course, you had, you know, the court bureaucrats and the people who pass Confucian translation and memorization exams. Sorry, not translation, just memorization. But they had to, these new thinkers had to grapple with words like society, citizenship, the concept of voting, the concept of participation in government. All of this was completely alien. And they were very brave to build a vision of a possible Chinese republic using these texts and explaining to their fellow countrymen what these concepts were. And, you know, for a while, these ideas were very popular. They sparked the May 4th movement in 1919, where students and intellectuals were crying for some of the same freedoms as the West: freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of participation, and so forth. And then China itself dissolved into civil war between kind of local chieftains, and then the communists and the nationalists hashed it out. And then in 1949, the Communist Party takes over. And of course, the Communist Party was not particularly interested in how Greek political theory could help them run the country. And so all of that stuff was thrown out. And so was Confucius, for that matter. He was seen as no more helpful than the Greek tradition. And then as time went on, it started creeping back. And so you see some of the same ideas coming back. Let's learn from the West. Let's learn from these texts. These texts support democracy. These texts support, freedom of speech. And all of that is going along, and it's increasing until 1989 and Tiananmen Square, and then it gets squashed again completely. And that's the last we see of that impulse. Oh, let's learn from the West and the West's classical texts. That's finito. Yeah. It's now, let's benefit China using the Western classical texts in any way we can. And that's very different.
I mean, I was very struck by the fact that even when there is hostility to Western classical texts, at least hostility from some places, how these were extraordinarily embedded in some parts of Chinese cultural debate, political and cultural debate, in a way that I feel embarrassed by this. I'd not realized that, but also I think that seeing how a different culture deals with these texts with which we think we're so familiar, well, it's a bit of a kind of it's a charade, isn't it? The idea that people could take these texts and do such different things with them, way outside. I'm used to people kind of debating, oh God, well, was Plato a goodie or a baddie? Was he the origin of, appalling authoritarian regimes, or was he actually helping us build a just city? Right? I know that.
Yes, and yes, right.
It was all these things, but to read the stuff which you allow us to read, because it isn't translated, about engaging in that tradition in a different way, was it was eye-opening, sometimes jaw-dropping, and you're, I think, a very good guide here, because at one point you talk about a bloke, and you will be able to tell me who he is, who says that the whole of the classical tradition was basically made up by Renaissance scholars, that didn't exist. I mean, of course, the Greeks and the Romans, at a certain sense, did exist, but all this stuff is a fabrication of the Renaissance. And I thought when you started to write about that in the book, I thought, what's she going to do with this? And it was wonderfully refreshing when you said, look, what on earth is he trying to do? Because this guy is not stupid. This is a clever bloke. So how do we deal with the idea that you can claim that the whole thing's made up? Now, where did you go with that? I mean,
well, there are so many versions of that, Mary. You can claim the whole thing is made up, or you can claim, as has been claimed in the West as well, that the most important influences came from North Africa and Asia. Or you can claim that these texts existed, but the West has been reading them wrongly all along. Right? And all of these are sort of Chinese possibilities for grappling with these texts from antiquity. But the texts themselves are so pliable, as you've said yourself. You can have an extremely intelligent and respected scholar like Tong Dong Bai write a book called Against Political Equality, and in it, he very seriously, and this is a thing that I think is different about China and the West and the reception, he very seriously takes Confucius's Analects and Plato's Republic, and especially Callipolis, as two possible models for a modern polity. So he doesn't say, let's look at this stuff in the past. He says, which of these two would serve us better in the present? And that's something, so that's the direct opposite of saying it doesn't exist at all, right? But that's something I also don't really see in the West, right? I mean, of course, nobody's going to say, does Plato serve us better than Confucius? The thing is, in China, they have such respect for the wisdom of their own classical texts, and sometimes for ours, that they're willing to undertake this kind of study. And it works in this case because Confucius and Plato did share a lot of beliefs. For example, a belief that stable hierarchies are absolutely necessary if the state is going to survive and not crumble or not be run over by revolutionaries. If, for the good of everybody, the argument is, you need what shall I say, the cleaning ladies to stay cleaning ladies, you need the mathematicians to stay mathematicians, you need the soldiers to stay soldiers, you need the philosophers to stay philosophers. And if there's more than a minimum of transition between these levels, you're in trouble, right? And Callipolis is a little bit like that, and Confucius is very much like that. And there's a point of analogy there, which in the end Tong Dong-bai rejects, because he says Confucius never rejects the family, but Plato does. And so Confucius is actually probably a more realistic model.
But you're also, I think, quite enlightening and delicate-footed in the book about how far we should be thinking about subversive readings here. I mean, you've just kind of partly alluded to the idea of the noble lie, Plato's noble lie, that that actually you kind of discover at age 18, whether you've got gold inside you, silver inside you, or bronze inside you.
Right.
And we know most of us, sorry, bronze for me. And
it's all natural, of course, right? Yes. Mother Earth gave it to you. It's not anything to do with you, right?
And there's been a lot of discussion by people who know Plato 50 times better than I do about how you understand the nature. Is Plato suggesting that the whole hierarchy is kind of rests on what is essentially an untruth? Is he really suggesting that? But I think that when you come to look at how Chinese commentators, not just scholars, but more general commentators, have come to look at that, you do end up wondering whether, if as a Chinese writer I accept Plato's version as a lie, Plato's version of how it is and why it is we should know our place in, am I actually saying I have seen through communist China, and what I found at the bottom of it is another lie? So how far is some of this dressed up as a kind of intellectual endeavor, but is in part a critique of the regime, or how far isn't it? I mean, and that's, you tease us quite a lot with that. I think rightly tease us, because we can't know.
I have no idea what the answer to that is, Mary. So yes, in the West, mostly scholars have said, oh, Plato's noble lie and Callipolis, it's either very nasty in a form of eugenics, which is what Karl Popper said, or else with my colleague in political theory here, you can say that the noble lie is actually being exposed by Plato as a reflection upon Pericles' new citizenship laws, the idea that only somebody with two Athenian parents, somebody whose blood is fully Athenian, can be Athenian. So that in itself is a kind of Platonic type thinking, which, according to Dimi Kasimius's reading, is an exposure of contemporary political problems and not a recipe for what the state should look like. But on the Chinese side, so before 1989, all the Chinese are writing, as many Westerners did, oh my goodness, we're so shocked to read this, this is not good. This is where Plato really shows himself up as the conservative, elitist, eugenicist he is. And then after 89, you have this strange phenomenon where they're writing and saying, yes, well, duh, it's only the West that has a problem with the noble lie, because we Chinese know that, of course, the government lies to its citizens. How else could it be the government, right? And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, oh, wow, yeah, so they really support the Chinese government. Yes, yes, lies are necessary. And then I was giving this in a talk and a Chinese student stuck her hand up and she said, excuse me, what if they are saying, yes, the noble lie is true in our country, and that's wonderful, in order to critique the use of lying in the Chinese government, but they're praising it, which is one of the best forms of how you criticize something. And it's actually a trope familiar to us from Western antiquity too, put a lot of praise in and then say what you want and nobody's going to figure out anything.
Exactly. And we could say, when Pliny gets up and gives a vote of thanks to Trajan, as you've written about, what he's doing is he's critiquing the Roman emperor, but the best way of critique is to praise.
Absolutely.
In a minute, I want to go just a bit wider, but if there was one thing that, in terms of the way you think about Plato, Aristotle, or Thucydides, if there was the one thing that you kind of have taken away from all the work you've done, where you think, right, okay, that has opened my eyes, what would it be?
It's a shamefully basic thing, Mary. It's the difference between our inheritance of Athens as a democracy, and of course that's a very big deal in the West, and our inheritance of classical Greek political theory, which is largely anti-democratic. And what struck me is how much we talk about the former, but how little we engage in kind of the scathing critique of this tradition, as we might want to, but we don't. And I started thinking, well, the Chinese are right, actually. Much of the classical Western tradition is closer to the kind of government that the Chinese have now than what we have. Yeah. And, the Chinese view that one person, one vote is not the acme, the moral and political acme of any philosophical system. Well, maybe we should think about that, but we don't like to think about that, and so we don't.
No, that is very much the takeaway that I came away with. I mean, I think that, the banalisation of Western views of democracy to, somebody putting a vote in a ballot box, that would amaze Pericles, and it would be rightly critiqued by any Chinese intellectual that you like, and yet we take it sort of for granted
as gospel,
as kind of gospel. And so I think it was quite usefully unsettling. I also thought, here in the UK, and I don't think it's quite the same in the US, we think that it's kind of uniquely our prime ministers, and particularly one prime minister, who trades in classical illusions. Well, the president of the People's Republic of China does too, everybody.
Absolutely. And people actually get his illusions, although they might not be getting Boris's, right? Because everybody is familiar with their own tradition in that country.
No, that's right.
I started one interesting article that was actually a history of Western antiquity, and the Chinese author said, it's very difficult to write about this because all American scholars start with the premise that American-style democracy is the only political form that should exist in the world. And so anything you say that isn't in line with that is just considered wrong. Right?
Yeah.
And I felt for him, I once, this is going to sound terrible, but once over lunch, I said to somebody, oh, I quite like Singapore. And they looked at me and they said, you are Stalin. And I said, actually, I'm Stalin, which I thought was funny. But as if even saying you like Singapore is to say that you are kind of a racist, fascist, born and bred, whatever.
Yeah, no, I think the whole democracy stuff was, which comes up throughout the book was extremely interesting. It reminded me of, teaching students. It's a very long time ago now, about 30 years ago. And one of the exercises I used to give them in class, not on paper, was, okay, now tell me why the Soviet Union is more democratic than the United States.
For Switzerland.
And they
What
looked, they thought, what?
Yes. Right.
But after 10 minutes, they didn't necessarily agree with what they were saying, but they could do the argument. They could see that if you stood outside Western democracy, you could make quite different claims, but you had to defamiliarize yourself.
Right. And I don't want the audience here to think that I'm anti-democratic, not at all. I just question the simplicity around which
that's right.
some ideas of democracy are constructed.
None of us are going to sign up for autocracy or tyranny or dictatorship.
Not right now,
no way, everybody.
No.
But I mean, I think that, in a sense, what you're saying is we think we know what democracy is and we haven't thought hard enough. And the kind of Eastern perspective on that, Chinese perspective, actually does help us think harder.
I think it does, and of course there are multiple Chinese perspectives. So on the one hand, you have very public statements to the effect that democracy is unstable, that it's a potential source of chaos, which the Chinese people wouldn't want, having seen enough chaos, and that Thucydides was right, and even American democracy is just going to go over a cliff any day now, which we almost did with Trump, actually.
Well, yeah, look at the last 12 months of the UK government, if you want.
Well, exactly, there too.
Chaos, right.
Then you have other people, including Xi Jinping, saying, we're very cross about the fact that the Americans have monopolized and weaponized the idea of democracy and defined it as only what they do. And so nobody else is really a democracy. But we in China, we are democratic because, at the lowest level, at the village level, we do have elections for minor officials. And then, yes, later it gets to be more meritocratic, and later still, they don't go into detail. But their point is that why can't we be called democratic? So on the one hand, they want to abjure the word as a dirty word, and related to instability and chaos. And then on the other hand, they want to claim that they are also a democracy. And these kinds of contradictions are everywhere. There's no one narrative that one can look at.
And I think it opens your eyes to your own contradictions. I mean, it is extremely interesting to see this. It's extremely interesting to see, the Chinese president, knowing something about Thucydides. He actually knows something. But it's, you look and you through your eyes, I have to say, you see inconsistencies in that, and then you think, but those inconsistencies, they're not the same as my inconsistencies, but they're analogous too, and those inconsistencies have shown me mine. And so I think it was I think it's in some ways bad to read a book about China and come away thinking that the take-home point was about me. That's kind of slightly self-regarding, but I hope you know what I mean. That it was this book is an eye-opener.
I also want to add that however we may say that, gosh, we don't like the way the Chinese are reading our classics or what have you, I am amazed by the fact that they pay attention to our classics, perhaps more than we do in Europe and the US, right? Yeah. They're fundamentally important texts. They say things like, if we want to overtake the West, we have to understand their classics, right? And, I find that amazing because in our little closed off cubicle here, I've never heard anybody saying if we want to understand, if we want to improve on China, we better start reading Confucius, right? Or Marcus.
No, that's right.
Nobody says that. Yeah.
But to kind of cast the net a bit more widely, I mean, you were working on this book at the same time as you were writing a wonderful translation of the Aeneid. Now, did those two come together at all in your head?
They did a bit. The reason for that was, as I was translating, I became increasingly conscious of the fact that many of the, male translators before me had made assumptions about which words to use in their translations, and had made assumptions about who is in the right and who is in the wrong on political matters and matters of taking over indigenous peoples and squashing them, right? And I thought, well, wait a minute, there's a lot, the text isn't nearly as unsubtle as that, right? So, for example, we know that before Virgil takes up the story of Aeneas, the tradition about him is mainly negative. He was represented as one of the possible people who turned Troy over to the Greeks for a big chunk of money and then fled.
Yes.
And when the native Italians, the ones who get defeated, when they are criticizing Aeneas, whether it's Amata or Turnus or any of them, they say exactly the things about him that the previous tradition held. They say he's a brigand, a liar, a traitor, that he's come to steal a woman, just as Paris did.
The Romans too.
Easterner. And so he curls his hair, whatever the Roman prejudices were about Easterners. And there's tons of stuff like that. And if you read a book about it, they say, oh, well, you can discount these voices because they're prejudiced against Aeneas. Well, yes, they are. But, how do we know Aeneas is in the right? Or the language used around Dido and Aeneas's relationship. It's quite clear, and as I'm sure you and most people know, that, one goddess says it's marriage between Aeneas and Dido, and one goddess says it's just a torrid affair, right? So there's a split. Dido happens to be on the side of the marriage goddess, Juno, and Aeneas happens to be on the side of, let's bonk in the cave and leave, which is Venus. Yeah. But that's never brought out properly in the text. And nor is it properly brought out that Dido in the whole epic is the only person who says of Aeneas as he sails away that he's impious. Everywhere else he's pious Aeneas. She's the only one to say, or to see, if you will, that his actions are actually not pious. So Virgil has given him the sobriquet, pious Aeneas, and it's become so standard that it stopped, I think, 2,000 years worth of readers from saying, well, actually, he's not really that pious, except for a few brave Italians who were then, I think, ostracized from classics altogether. So,
yeah.
So in both cases, I think what got to me was when traditions are normative, there's a reason.
Yeah. Yes.
And the reason is not always a nice one, as we know all too well in classics, but also having seen how the Chinese can read our classics and make hay of them, as it were, while the sun shines. Why can't we read our classics and make hay with them? Why do they have to be about nastiness, imperialism, murder, sexism, and all the horrible reasons why we've attributed bad things to them? Because it's not necessary. You can read the Aeneid with a view to further voices, sublimated voices, voices with no voice, right? The perspective of women.
And you can read the Aeneid saying, when we come to the very end and Aeneas kills Turnus.
And the great civilizer is at the mercy of his rage.
Right. And you think, I bet Augustus didn't like that when he heard it first, because it's saying, what is the cost? What is the cost?
Absolutely. And Augustus paid that cost. And then he quickly covered it up by becoming Augustus and leaving behind the murderous legacy of Octavian as much as he could, right? Much as Virgil leaves behind the murderous legacy of the original Aeneas, right?
I mean, so, one of the things you seem to be saying, and I feel very sympathetic to it, is that it's not just, when looking in China or looking at the Aeneid or whatever, it's not just that, there are new things and different things to think about our own self-satisfaction about our democratic decision, the solipsism of some of those traditions, but that within the kind of battles that I think rightly go on in classics at the moment, between a view which says that classical texts have been weaponized for almost every human crime that you can possibly imagine, apparently opposed to people who would rather not notice that and think that they're beautiful. But there is actually a different way of seeing this, which is to say, what do we want to do with these texts? How can we play with them?
I'm so sympathetic to that view. Well, in fact, I should be, because it's my view. But yes, so, look, the Aeneid gets published and it becomes a school text because Augustus treats it as if it's propping up his regime, and Servius and others come along and say, this is about the praise of Augustus. Okay, that's step one. Then, some medieval Christians come along and say, nonsense, this is about the Christian everyman, right? And it shows the wonderful rise of the uneducated soul into Christianity, conveniently leaving out book 12, by the way. And then we have, Americans coming across it in the 19th century and saying, oh, look, this supports westward expansion. It's our God-given duty to move west and squash the Native Americans, right? God wants us to do it. We're being pious by doing this. And then we've got, during the Vietnam War, and now we've got people saying it's a murderous book about conquering and murdering. You've got Mussolini saying it's about the Italian Empire living forever. And look, here I am, Mussolini, Benito, just call me Aeneas, And so why are we acting paralyzed today? If every generation has found something that speaks to them in these books,
yes,
are we going to be the only ones they don't speak to?
And, actually, I kind of think, this is appallingly presentist notion, but I'm kind of unashamedly, they're for us. Virgil doesn't own this text any longer. We own it. It's ours. Let's do something which is good with it. And in some ways, Plato Goes to China is a prompt to do that, because you see that much more in the case of what's going on in these Chinese readings.
And it doesn't have to be cynical, right? You don't have to say, I will shape this text unto my will, ha, 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 and I will sell more copies of it. No, I actually believe that Virgil was sensitive to these issues, and that's why we can find them in his book. And if I didn't believe that, and I claim to find them in his book, then that would be distasteful, and I don't think that would be a good model for pedagogy at all.
No,
right?
I don't think that kind of manipulation is good, nor do I think kind of self-righteous readings are good. But you have opened up, I think, by taking us outside, you've opened up it's very surprisingly, because it isn't what I expected when I read the book. I expected a very interesting and learned account of how we could understand China better if we looked at it through this lens. And I think that we do. You deliver on my expectation, but actually you deliver on more than that. So it was truly wonderful, Shadi. My only question to finish with now, because we have to be joined to close, is what are you going to work on next, or what are you working on now?
Mary, I have no idea. And I'm so perplexed that I've decided to take up mountain climbing so I don't have to think about it. Maybe that was my last book. I'm just going to fall off the top of Everest and I'll be done.
Yeah, something will come out of whatever you do, dear, I'm sure. So thank you very much for talking to us today. And thanks to ClassicsNow Festival, which has given us the chance to have a chat about this.
And it was a wonderful chance. Thank you, Mary. Okay, bye-bye. Enjoy your evening.
Bye.